Hello and welcome. This is an introductory video that provides some background information about the primary sources of Islam that make up the Sharia, or the Islamic law, which dictates much of Islamic thinking. It is an overview of the sources that form the basis of Islam and, importantly, that Muslims trust. If you know a lot about this already, you can probably skip this video, but if you are new to this area, I would recommend you have a think about these different sources. They will be the main things that I unpack throughout many of the videos. I will look to them as the main sources of information about Islam, so it is important to have a good understanding about them. The Sharia, or the Islamic law, can be seen as composed of three parts: the Qu'ran, the Hadith, the work of Islamic scholars. The Quran is well known. It is the revelation and recitations of Muhammad. It was revealed to Muhammad between 610 and 632 AD. The method by which the written Quran was composed from the oral tradition of Muhammad is a bit more complex. Now I will give a summary of the traditional Islamic view of how the book was formed. I'm not personally that sure about the story, but here it is. I recently read one academic say that the majority of academics are agnostic on the subject, feeling that there is not enough evidence to either confirm or deny the traditional Islamic account. The traditionalists, who are predominantly Muslim, will say this traditional story is definitely how the Quran was composed. Then you have the skeptics, who say it is definitely not how the Quran was composed. The story goes like this. As Muhammad was going around Saudi Arabia teaching, ruling, and living his life, his various companions and scribes wrote down his sayings and revelations. As an aside, a companion is like a disciple. Throughout Muhammad's life, his followers were memorizing and spreading his revelations. These revelations were collectively referred to as the Quran. After Muhammad's death, the first caliph, Abu Bakr, became worried that parts of the Quran might be lost. This was because a large number of Muslims who had been memorizers of the Quran were killed at the Battle of Yamama, and at this point the Quran was predominantly an oral tradition. In response, Abu Bakr commissions a man named Ibn Zayd to go around and compile a written Quran. Zayd says in Bukhari Hadith 7191 that this job is harder than moving a mountain. Despite this, he goes, finds, and assesses all the different sources. The Quran had been written in parts on parchment, on date palms, and had been memorized. You can see here the Hadith where the story is related. Pause as appropriate if you would like to read it in full. Zayd gradually goes through and compiles these into the first written Quran and gives it to Abu Bakr, who stores but does not distribute it. At the same time, different teachers and companions of Muhammad are going out to teach the new Islamic empire about the recitations of Muhammad. It's not a fully centralized process, but a more organic one. Each teacher would go out and recite the Quran in one of a number of different but accepted ways. Over time, these differences, combined with differences in pronunciation and a lack of clear written text, lead to debates and disputes on how the Quran should be recited and what should be included in it. I will discuss this in more detail in a later video. When it comes to Caliph Othman's reign, he is the third caliph. The army is upset, and Othman worries this issue could become a source of disunity and a potential civil war. To manage the tensions, Othman finds Zayd and gives him a new job of standardizing all of the Qurans into one Quran. Zayd has all of the Qurans in the empire collected and then replaces them with one standardized version. The rest of the manuscripts were destroyed. This story can be found in Sahih Bukhari Hadith 4987. You can see it here, and so pause as appropriate if you would like to read it in full. The modern Quran is thought to be a descendant of this Quran produced in the reign of Othman, normally referred to as the Uthmanic Quran. Even within the Uthmanic version there are a number of different readings, which correspond to different possible pronunciations. More on this in a later video. However, we still have some early Quranic manuscripts despite Othman's purge, and we will discuss them more later on. This concludes my summary of the traditional story of the compilation of the Quran. The Quran is mostly composed of Muhammad reciting the words of God directly. This can be surprising if you are used to the Bible, where you have a mix of genres. Instead, you just have God speaking directly in a poetic form. Most Muslims would say that the Quran is only really authoritative in original Arabic. Translations are seen as an approximation at best. The second leg of the Sharia is the Hadith, or as the collections are sometimes called, the Ahadith. The Hadith are collections of sayings and actions of Muhammad. The Quran and the Hadith are collectively referred to as the Sunnah, from which the word Sunni is derived. These videos will be focused on Sunni Islam. For Sunni Muslims, there are 6 major volumes of Hadith, the 2 most trusted being Sahih Bukhari and Sahih Muslim. In my experience, the other 4 volumes are rarely quoted and often greeted with a degree of distrust. I will therefore focus my comments on Sahih Bukhari and Sahih Muslim, which are pretty much unanimously accepted by Sunni scholars as being authoritative sources of Islamic teaching. These were written between 850 and 900 AD, with Bukhari being the earlier of the 2. The Quran is very philosophical and gives a lot of overview and abstract information, while the Hadith give you the detail and the practice. There is precision in the Hadith where the Quran is more general. To give you an example, the Quran tells you that you have to pay zakat, a tax on the wealth of Muslims. Zakat is one of the 5 pillars of Islam. However, it is the Hadith that tells you how much zakat you should pay. If you are a goat rearer, you should pay 1 goat in 40. If you are a farmer whose fields can be irrigated, you should pay 10% of your harvest. But if your fields cannot be irrigated, you should pay only 5%. Some Muslims reject the Hadith entirely. However, this is very problematic because without the Hadith, you have very little detail on how to do Islam. For example, Muslims pray 5 times a day. This is a foundational part of Islamic practice, but the Quran sets only 3 times of prayer per day. It is the Hadith that instruct Muslims to pray 5 times a day. This reflects the importance of the Hadith in the practice of the Islamic faith. The Hadiths give more detail to Islamic practice, but they also tell us about what Muhammad did in his life. The Hadith, in combination with the biographies of Muhammad, allow us to interpret the Quran in the context of the events of Muhammad's life. As I said earlier, the Hadith collections we have now come from a much later period than the Quran, which was recited between 610 and 632 AD. The Hadith were written from 850 AD onwards. To give that some context, there were schools of Hadith prior to 850, but the Hadith were not all written down systematically until then. Before this point, there were many Hadith, some of which were seen as trustworthy and some which were not. The modern collections represent an attempt to compile all of the trustworthy Hadith into one place. The Bukhari and Muslim Hadith collections are seen as trustworthy in their entirety. The method by which a Hadith is defined as reliable is based on the chain of transmission. The chain of transmission is the list of names of the different people a Hadith had to pass through to reach Imam Bukhari or Muslim. And the trustworthiness of a Hadith is based upon the trustworthiness of those people it passes through. There is in fact a whole area of study in the science of analysing the chain of transmission. Feel free to investigate this if you are interested, but for the sake of these videos, we will focus on those Hadith that are unanimously taken as trustworthy by Sunni scholars. When I use any other, I will try and make that clear. Thirdly, we have the work of Islamic scholars. This is basically the work and consensus of Islamic scholars. You cannot just open the Quran and take a verse or ayah and make up your own interpretation. You have to show that your interpretation is consistent with that of scholars. In particular, you need to show that it is consistent with the views of the most ancient Muslims. Particularly, they have to be consistent with the traditional tafsirs, commentaries on the Quran, as well as the Hadith. On the whole, old trumps new. Interpretations that are ancient and consistent with what Muslims have always thought are seen as better than those which are newer. In particular, special weight is given to the opinions of the first generation of Muslims. Also, modern Islamic scholars can provide ruling on subjects which are not covered in the Quran or the Hadith, for example, internet pornography. There is a lot of debate about how all of these things work out in practice. The important thing to understand is that when I talk about what something means, I'm not trying to give my opinion so much as I'm trying to reconstruct the interpretation of the first generation of Muslims. My aim, although I am sure I will fall far short of this, is to interpret the Quran and the Hadith in such a way that it could conjure a scholar of early Islamic thought that he would say, yes, that's what we thought. There you go. These are the 3 constituents of Sharia. You have the Quran, the Hadith, and the work of Islamic scholars. Some Muslims don't see the work of the scholars as authoritative in the same way as the Quran and the Hadith, but they are in practice the process by which the Quran and the Hadith are turned into applicable teaching which can be followed by the normal believer. I hope this has been helpful.